Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats. We're about to start. Good morning again. I am Malou Harrison, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Miami Book Fair, the 2017 edition. And what a wonderful week it has been, and it's not even over. I hope you're enjoying all of the presentations, the engagement, and the hustle and bustle of the book fair and the street fair in particular. And I would like to give a special welcome to those fairgoers who are from out of town. Can I see a show of hands for our out-of-town visitors? Welcome to Miami. As many of you know, this fair would not be possible without the collaboration of hundreds of volunteers, corporate and community sponsors, such as OHL and many others. And I might add, without the convening of Miami-Dade College, which is the founder and true presenter of Miami Book Fair. So let's give a round of applause to Miami-Dade College. We're going to get started. This room is always full of engagement. Once the guest speaker has concluded, you have the opportunity to ask questions. We'll have a few minutes for questions, so please do access the mic in the middle for that purpose. So at this time, I'd like to ask you to silence your devices and follow me as I give a brief introduction of our guest speaker today, Norman Ornstein. Norman Ornstein is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a contributing editor and columnist for the National Journal and The Atlantic. He is a co-author of New York Times bestseller, It's Even Worse Than It Looks. His book, One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported. It's truly an essential book for this era, as many of us would agree, and a true unsparing assessment of the current state of the United States. And it also serves as an inspiring roadmap for how we can move forward together on a unified front to advance our nation. Please help me to welcome Norman Ornstein to Miami Book Fair.
Thank you so much, and I must say, I've been to many book fairs. There is nothing like this. And it is a real testament to this city for the incredible intellectual diversity that it brings, and this crowd, which blows me away, is certainly a testament to that. I just want to add one little footnote to the introduction, which tells us something about our times. Back in 1992, I was the first pollster for Comedy Central in its first coverage of our politics Indecision 92. And I just want to tell you about the first poll that I did, a kind of inspired poll. Back then, all of the television networks would get these 900 phone numbers where they would have viewers call in and pay 75 cents to give their opinion on an issue. So we got our own 900 call-in number, and the question that I asked our viewers was, would you pay 75 cents to call in and ask your opinion on an issue? And we were flooded with calls, and 97% said no. So as you look at polls, just keep that in the back of your mind. So we are at day 294 of the Trump presidency, or as President Trump says, longer than any other president. And for me, as for many others, it has been 294 days of mostly unrelenting pain. I have two co-authors on this book. One, a longtime co-author of mine over almost 50 years of partnership. And we did a book in 2006 about Congress called The Broken Branch. And then we did that book about our politics more generally in 2012 called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. And then we updated it in 2016 to It's Even Worse Than It Was. And I joked for some time that the next book would have to be called Run for Your Lives. But we decided to go in a slightly different direction, and we added in a third co-author, the wonderful Washington Post columnist, Brookings scholar, and academic E.J. Dionne. And I do want to say, as I will probably repeat a few times, it makes a great holiday gift. And Thanksgiving is right around the corner. Bar mitzvahs, christenings, brisses, anything. Great, great gift. We felt a need to address what had happened to our politics and to our country and to our culture. And yet, after three books that could have easily given me the title of the Debbie Downer of American politics, this book, which is a tough critique, also is hopeful at the end, and I will come to that. And I will say, I was a little hopeful even during the campaign. I talked to some of my nervous friends, and I said, don't worry, even if he gets elected, he won't be there long. He'll leave us for a younger country. He may be leaving us for an older country before we know it, but that's a different matter. But let me talk just a little bit about what's in the book and address the situation a little more generally, and then I'm hopeful that we can have some dialogue as well. This book is really in three parts. The first part is how we got here. The second is what the dangers are. And the third is what we can do about it and where we're going. And I will say that a part of my motivation for doing this, and I came up with the subtitle first, which covers much of the country, that I would have people say to me every day, what do we do? What do we do now? And we really felt the need to try and talk about what can be done and how we need to rise. And the hopefulness is built on a belief that Donald Trump has jolted us and jolted the country into realizing what the threat is. And I will come back to that. But first, let me talk a bit about how we got here. And there, we're not referring to just getting Donald Trump, but to the conditions that led to a Trump, that go back decades, and that we could call the rise of Trumpism, but it's something even broader than that, and I don't want to just play into his ego on that front either. And at least a part of it is broader changes in the society that go beyond our politics. And so we have a chapter on the decline of community, the atomization in the country, the sense of detachment that people have from their own communities, from their citizens, that has taken place over a lot of swaths of territory in the country. Some of which written about very, very eloquently by Robert Putnam in his seminal book, Bowling Alone. Also by the journalist Bill Bishop in his book, more recent vintage, The Big Sort, where people have increasingly moved into areas where they're surrounded by like-minded people, but it has also created this sense of geographical detachment of one group of citizens from another. And this does go back a long ways. We even had sociologists in the 1960s bemoaning the decline in community. But of course, it's also tied to some of the great economic dislocations that have occurred over many decades. And there's another very powerful book by the sociologist Kai Erikson about a community in West Virginia that really was a small town and a vibrant community where citizens were linked to one another, where the community institutions worked very well, and then they had a flood. And it kind of destroyed the livelihood, and the community fell apart. Those institutions stopped working, and we saw enormous dysfunction built into it. We had as well the book by the great African-American sociologist William Julius Wilson about what happened in the thriving communities in inner cities with an African-American working class population when the jobs moved out. And as that happened, the community went under enormous stress and decline. And it's the same sort of thing, of course, that we see now with Hillbilly Elegy and other places, with rural areas and exurban areas and places where things aren't working the way they used to. And these problems in society transcend all of the categories that we normally think about, including the racial ones. And we are seeing it play out in a lot of places now. And those stresses are there, and a part of our great challenge is to re-knit and rebuild community in the country and rebuild it around something broader than a local area as well. Recreate this great sense of patriotism that is not the negative nationalism pitting one group against another, blood and soil, that we are seeing played out now. There's a real distinction between the two. But there's also the political side of it. And here, too, the seeds of Donald Trump and Trumpism go back quite a ways. Some of it, let's face it, are because of the enormous changes in our geography that changed our politics, going back at least to the 1960s, starting with Barry Goldwater, that seminal moment when LBJ signed the Voting Rights Act and turned to his then aide, Harry McPherson, and said, "This is going to cost the Democratic Party the South for generations to come." Some of it actually even precedes that, and the rise of air conditioning as a common phenomenon. I'm old enough to remember when I was a kid and air conditioning was not commonplace in homes. In a hot day, we would go to the movie theater to cool off. But then it became a commonplace thing, and all of a sudden the South became a place where people could move and live year-round. And that meant a lot of seniors moving from the Northeast and the Midwest down south, and those were often Republicans who had populated regions in the Northeast and the Midwest that were thriving places for moderate Republicans, and moved them south, and it helped to make, along with the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Revolution, the South moving from a solidly Democratic region to the most significant Republican region. And of course, music. I often ask to be accompanied by music, but right now, I'd rather not. That also, with the way districting took place, created some great divisions racially in the South that transformed it as well. The Northeast and Midwest that had been bastions of moderate Republicans became strongholds for Democrats. The West Coast went through a similar transformation. And we saw our parties that had been, when I first came to Washington, kind of conglomerates cutting across a lot of ideological boundaries, but with most of the members somewhere near the middle, begin to change. And those changes affected both parties, but they affected one more than the other. You know, back in the 1970s, when I was teaching political science full-time, I would describe Congress in this sense. I would say, imagine if we took all the members and put them on buses and drove them 1.5 miles due east of the Capitol to what was then our football stadium, RFK Stadium. And we told them to go down on the field and place themselves where their worldview would make them most comfortable. And we went up into the press box. We would look down on what would be like a normal distribution. The vast majority of people somewhere near the midfield stripe, generally between the 40-yard lines, and quite an admixture between the two parties, trailing off to a small number as you move down away from the midfield area. Well, if we fast forward to today and repainted the football lines on the now defunct stadium and went up into the press box and looked down on the members of the 115th Congress, we would see a pretty barren midfield area. And on one side of the field, a lot of people congregated around the 20, 25-yard line, trailing off to a smaller number. And on the other side, you'd have one or two people before you got to the goal line, and then you'd have a whole lot behind the goalposts and even more floating in the Anacostia River nearby. And that's a real change in our politics. But the fact is, you can have a polarization of this sort that we've talked about so much and still have problem solving. And I look back on, for example, The Odd Couple. Last week, my co-author EJ and I were up at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute on the Senate in Boston, where they've recreated the Senate chamber. And I was reflecting on that odd couple relationship between Teddy Kennedy, proud liberal, and Orrin Hatch, a proud conservative, lifestyles that could not have been more different, but a close friendship, and the Children's Health Insurance Program, which has provided health insurance to 9 million children, wouldn't exist if it weren't for that relationship. Now, it'll also tell you something about the tribal nature of our politics now and the radicalization that Children's Health Insurance Program is now almost 2 months without being funded. And we have 9 million children left vulnerable as a consequence. And the chairman of the committee responsible for it is Orrin Hatch, who has instead decided to push through a tax bill that provides great benefits for owners of private jets while taking away the scholarship tax-free status for graduate students. So even those people who were problem solvers are not anymore, but we had it back then. And that began to change, and frankly, it began to change with Newt Gingrich. And when Newt came into Congress, and I met him right after he arrived after the 1978 election, and met him in January of 1979, and Tom and I sponsored a series of small dinners every couple of months with members of the class of 1978 to take them through, off the record, their experiences in their first term in Congress. And we picked 8 people representing different viewpoints and different regions, but also we wanted to pick people who would make a mark. And it was quite a class, and we chose pretty well. Besides Newt, we had Dick Cheney and Geraldine Ferraro among them. But Newt sort of dominated the conversations because he wanted to find a way, he knew right from the day he got there, to create a Republican majority in Congress. At the time he arrived, 24 consecutive years for Democrats, became 40, and he knew the only way to do it, he believed, was to create this national sense of disgust with politics and Washington and everybody there, so that people would say, throw them all out, and that meant the ins would go and the outs would come in. And he exploited it by prodding a majority which, to be frank, had, after 24 years, power does corrupt. They had become arrogant and complacent and were condescending towards the minority, and often a little corrupt, and they overreacted. But Newt deliberately tribalized the process, tried to radicalize his own party, including those who had gone along with the majority because they got some of the policies they wanted, and then do the same thing in the country. And a populist outrage in the late 1980s over a pay raise for public officials, and Bill Clinton's election gave him the vehicle to do it, but it permanently transformed the way we deal with our politics. And he brought in a group of people who viewed the world in tribal ways and also viewed Washington as an utter cesspool. And just to give you one story that I first wanted to be careful wasn't apocryphal, that tells you sort of what happened in our politics. One of the people who came in during that Gingrich era into the House was a man named Rick Santorum, now familiar to many, who then moved on to the Senate from Pennsylvania. And several years after he left the Senate, one of my dear friends and great heroes, Alan Simpson, a conservative Republican from Wyoming, came back to visit the Senate, and he walked into the Capitol, and Santorum saw him, and they walked into the chamber together, and Alan Simpson saw across the chamber Dale Bumpers, also familiar to many, a former Democratic senator from Arkansas. And Al made a beeline over to Bumpers, and they had a warm embrace, and they were chatting warmly. And then he saw Santorum back where they'd come in, looking agitated. And motioned him over, and Simpson ambled back and said, "Yeah?" And Santorum said, "What was that all about?" And Simpson said, "That's Dale Bumpers. We're almost like blood brothers. We came in together, we're dear friends, we worked on many things." And Santorum said, "We don't do things like that around here anymore." And that's tribalism. Now, when I saw Simpson to validate the story, and he said it had happened, I said, "Well, was he agitated because you were embracing a Democrat or because you were embracing a guy?" And I won't tell you his response, but maybe a little bit of both. But that tribalism mattered. And at the same time, that pay raise that I mentioned mattered as well. That was in 1988. And what we had was the elites in the society. At the time, we had what were called quadrennial commissions every 4 years. The presidents of universities, the captains of industry, the leaders of religious institutions would come together and try and evaluate what we should do with the pay of members of Congress and judges and top executives. And they decided that because they hadn't had a raise in 10 years and it was getting hard to find judges willing to come in for those lifetime appointments, and members of Congress with 2 households were getting stressed, that they'd make up for 10 years of inflation with a 25% pay raise. And it was supported by Ronald Reagan as he left office, and George Herbert Walker Bush, his successor, and all the leaders in Congress, and the public went ballistic. Now, the previous year, the Federal Communications Commission had eliminated the so-called fairness doctrine, which said that if you're in a broadcast and you present one point of view, you have to balance it with another. And with that, Rush Limbaugh, who had been a noontime talk show host in Sacramento on radio, moved to New York to try and make his way, and then the pay raise gave him the rocket to stardom. And that created talk radio as a political phenomenon, and it began the tradition of tribal media that we have now. All of those things mattered, and all of it became amplified as we moved through into the Obama era. And then what we saw was the economic strains and the populism that emerged full-blown with the financial collapse in 2008, and the response of the elites as President George W. Bush and his Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson and the chair of the Fed, Ben Bernanke, and all the previous chairs of the Fed met with the leaders in Congress and said the entire global economy could collapse. It could make the Great Depression look mild by comparison. We have to act now. And they came up with the bailout known as the TARP program, the Troubled Assets Relief Program. What many people fail to remember is that it actually failed despite that urgency and the enormous support in the House of Representatives, because a group of radical House Republicans said, "Why should we believe any of this?" And then the Dow dropped over 700 points, which back then was a big deal. And they came back and passed it, but the resentments remained. And most Americans said, "Wait a minute, let me get this straight." Just like the 25% pay raise, when most of us were getting, if we were lucky, a 1% COLA a year, and maybe we were making $25,000 while they were making $87,500 and bitching and complaining that it wasn't enough. This time it was, so what you did was get together and bail out the miscreants who got us into this mess. And then they got big bonuses on top of that. And what happened to us? We lost our houses. Or if we didn't lose our houses, they declined in value by 30 or 40%. And most Americans don't have cash savings. Their nest egg is in the homes. And as you get older, you can downsize and have a retirement fund, or you can have money that you can give your kids for tuition or for a down payment on their homes. And that was devastating. And I will mention one thing that will tell you also something about the nature of our country and our times. A survey that's done every year and most recently showed the most shocking numbers that I've seen. People are asked, used to be $500, now it's $400. If you had an emergency that required $400 in cash, could you come up with it? 68% of Americans say no, right? So you blow a rod on your car. Tree hits the house and you gotta pay the deductible and the insurance. You have a medical emergency. You can't come up with the cash. And the bailout, what did that say? To those Americans, and even those with some resources, but who were hurt. you lost your job. Or if you didn't lose your job, with a stagnant economy, your employer knew they had you where they wanted you, and they could make you work longer hours for less pay. And we saw the Occupy Wall Street movement emerge on the left, and then the Tea Party movement on the right. And all of that began to feed on itself to create some of the seeds that could result in the emergence of a Donald Trump. And of course, Trump himself exploited that anxiety and some of the larger anxiety over the changes in our country, the growing diversity, the fact that by 2050, white Americans will no longer be a majority in the country, when he cynically exploited the birther movement to become the leader of a movement that is openly racist in nature. And that gave him a platform to run for president. Now, at the same time, as Obama came in, Republican leaders in Congress, on Inauguration Eve, 2009, desperate, demoralized, depressed, because not only had they lost the White House, they lost the House, they lost the Senate, and they met together on inaugural eve, a bunch of leaders, including some who called themselves the Young Guns: Paul Ryan, Eric Cantor, Kevin McCarthy, John Cornyn, the number 2 leader in the Senate, Gingrich himself. And they had dinner at the Caucus Room, a restaurant just a few blocks from the White House, and they emerged with a spring in their step because they'd figured out that the way to move ahead was to unite completely in opposition to everything that Obama and Democrats wanted and delegitimize any of the actions that were done, blocking as much as they could otherwise. And that worked like a charm heading into the midterm elections in 2010, and the Young Guns fanned around the country, taking a page from the Gingrich playbook, and recruited a bunch of candidates and exploited that Tea Party anger and said, you know, if you bring us into power and give us the Congress, we'll bring Obama to his knees, and we'll revoke Obamacare, and we'll blow up Dodd-Frank, and we'll blow up government as we know it. And they won this sweeping victory, and then none of it happened. And then they came back in 2012 and said, don't worry, if you vote for us, after all, the scales have been pulled away from the eyes of Americans. They know this Kenyan socialist for what he is. It'll be a one-term presidency, and then we can do what we want, and it didn't work. And then in 2014 we're outnumbered 2-1. They've got the Senate. If we can win the Senate, we outnumber them 2-1, and we'll bring Obama to his knees and get rid of Obamacare and Dodd-Frank and blow up government as we know it, and none of it happened. And that set the seeds for the 2016 nomination contest. Conventional wisdom said Republicans will do what they always do. They'll flirt with an outsider, the Herman Cains of the world, but then they'll nominate the obvious establishment candidate, and the obvious candidate was Jeb Bush. We'd had Bush 41, and we'd had Bush 43, and here was Jeb, the motto in the family, no child left behind. But Jeb was the lost child who was in fact left behind because the reaction of the Tea Party populist Republicans and conservatives out there was, you guys are no better than the other ones. You told us government was evil and you'd blow it up, and you didn't. You're establishment just like the rest of them, and an outsider was going to be the choice. Now, it didn't have to be Donald Trump. Could have been Ted Cruz. You know, the insider's outsider whose calling card was going on the floor of the Senate and calling his own leader, Mitch McConnell, a liar, which had never been done before. Or it could have been Carly Fiorina, a conservative woman who'd been a CEO. Or it could have been Ben Carson, the celebrated neurosurgeon, an African-American conservative. But Trump had his finger on the zeitgeist of the party and understood the dislocation that people felt in their loss of community, the sense that their own role in society was slipping away, and some of the ugly features of populism, the protectionism, the isolationism, the nativism, and often the racism that can accompany it. And it's when he got to the right of everybody else on immigration, talking about the Mexican rapists coming in and preying on us and putting up the fence and the wall and making Mexico pay for it, and a Muslim ban and all of that. And if you watch those debates, you can see Ted Cruz utterly befuddled that anybody could get to the right of him on anything. And it's when Trump took on the other candidates and belittled them, belittling Jeb and belittling little Marco. He really likes to belittle Floridians, I don't know what. And all the other candidates, and then taken on Fox News and Megyn Kelly, then with Fox News. And it was basically, I'm not like these weak establishment figures who bow down to Obama. I'm not taking crap from anybody. And he played on another great meme in American life, which is politics is so awful, they don't do anything, they're so corrupt. Why can't we run government like a business? And he gave them that promise of running government like a business. And I will tell you right now, we are fulfilling that promise. We are running government like a business. The business is Trump University. So, all of that enabled Trump to win a nomination, and the unease in the society and the frank reality that we had two candidates who were underwater in terms of public support gave him the conditions in which he could compete. And then a lot of things that happened in the final 2 weeks, combined with what we now know was a big, fat, Putin-esque thumb on the scales of our political system, combined with some voter suppression, which we now know made the difference, at least in Wisconsin, gave him the ability to win, even though he did not win the popular vote. Now, he won under the rules. That's a reality. Those rules may need some rethinking. And I'll just talk for 1 minute about the Electoral College and note that from the moment when the popular vote actually meant anything at all, in 1824, all the way up through 172 years and 44 elections, we had 3, arguably, in which there was some question about whether the winner of the popular mandate actually was elected president. 1 where it was very clear, 1 out of 44. From 2000 on, we've had 5 elections, 2 out of 5. And that tells you we're heading down a path, a very dangerous path, where increasingly we will see the winner of the popular vote lose the Electoral College. And it can happen once, and we can say those are the rules, which is what happened in 2000. When it happens twice, and then 3 times, and then 4 times, the question of the legitimacy of the presidency is going to be a very real one, and it's something we're going to have to deal with. Now, let me talk for a few minutes about the second part of the book, and we can come back to some of these other elements and what brought it about if you want. And that is the dangers that we have. And I want to mention 3 words to start with: autocracy, kleptocracy, and kakistocracy. The first 2 are familiar. Autocracy, and that's a real danger that we have. And we've seen now some very powerful books, including a bestseller by Timothy Snyder, a historian, called On Tyranny, about the steps that move you away from a vibrant democracy towards an autocracy. And the fact is, it goes sliding, step by step, little by little. I don't like to use this analogy. Jim Fallows is constantly talking against it, but this is a little bit like the frog put in the pot of cold water. It changes degree by degree, and it's only when it starts to boil that he realizes or she realizes that it's a point of no return. And what we know about autocracy is it starts with attacks on the free press. The press is the enemy of the people. A phrase originated by Stalin, rejected by Khrushchev as being too dangerous, picked up by Trump. It moves to attacks on the judiciary and the independent judiciary, which we saw during the campaign with the Mexican judge, which we've seen since in the attacks on judges who've ruled against the travel bans. We see it with attacks on the system of justice, now on the FBI, on the intelligence services, which are a threat, on Mueller himself, including from abroad. We see it with this sense of, I am the only one, back during the campaign, and the egotism. What Trump just said a couple of weeks ago with the multiple vacancies in almost all of the key positions in the State Department. We don't need to fill those. I'm the only one that matters. And in a whole host of ways, we see that movement. We see it in the attacks on facts and science and on the opposition, delegitimizing the opposition. The kleptocracy, we've never seen anything like this. The in-your-face moves to benefit personally with your family and throughout your entire administration from government itself. And that includes billionaire plutocrats like the Treasury Secretary and the head of the National Economic Council, as well as the president and his family. And the threat of an autocracy in a system designed, I'll go back to the first sentence in the book, American democracy was never designed to give us a president like Donald Trump. We're designed to create some boundaries around the process. Those boundaries that are working reasonably well with the independent judiciary, but start with an independent Congress. How many hearings in the House and Senate in 10 months on violations of the two emoluments clauses and on other efforts, including by the family, to enrich themselves? Zero, not one. No checks and balances. Now, kakistocracy is a 17th century term, comes from a Greek word that fell into disuse, and I'm now doing what I can to bring it back. And the Greek word basically means government by the worst and most unscrupulous among us, extended to the worst kind of government. So you have a president who has the least experience of any in our history, no experience in any level of government. The one who comes closest is Abraham Lincoln, one term in Congress. Lincoln knew that he needed people around him who knew what they were doing. Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, The Team of Rivals, was not about bringing a bunch of people together, pitting them against each other. It was, oh my God, I need the most experienced people, and that means bringing in people who hate me and who ran against me. Trump brings in Reince Priebus as his chief of staff, right? A guy who had been a party functionary and before that a term or so in the Wisconsin legislature. And I just want to remind you, whenever you see Reince, even though he's out of politics right now, always keep in mind that Reince Priebus without the vowels is RNC PRBS. So. Do not look at him without thinking of that. And then you bring in Steve Bannon and Steve Miller as your top actors. And then you bring into your cabinet Goldman Sachs executives and business types who've never served in government before. And then with the 600 or so top policy positions, Senate confirmable, that matter, deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, heads of bureaus and agencies, almost a year into the presidency, more than half of them unfilled and not even nominated for positions, including key ambassadorships. When you have a president who goes to Asia with the threat of a nuclear conflict with North Korea, and we do not have an ambassador in South Korea, and you don't trust anybody else, that is kakistocracy defined. When you have a Secretary of State hollowing out the diplomatic corps, and it'll take decades to bring back the experience of the people who are leaving in droves. None of that is an effective way to run government. And when you have a budget director who proudly calls himself a right-wing nutcase, I kid you not, who comes up with a budget that says, I'll tell you what, let's cut the spending for the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration because we don't like those weather satellites, because they tell us something about climate. But the weather satellites are our early warning system for hurricanes. So take away the early warning so people don't have an ability to prepare, and then cut funding for FEMA so that you can build the wall. Cut funding for the Centers for Disease Control, which deals with pandemics, when human history is that every 100 years, like clockwork, we have a pandemic. The last one was 1917, 1918. It killed more people than World War I and World War II combined did in the United States, the flu back then. That's kakistocracy. And all of those are things that need our focus. So, just a few minutes on, I know the time. Okay, thank you very much. a few minutes on why I'm a little hopeful and where we go from here. So, I believe, I thought of this a few weeks ago watching the quite remarkable movie Dunkirk by Christopher Nolan. And of course, in Dunkirk, the West was facing a deep threat. The British Army and its French allies beaten into submission, caught with 400,000 troops on the beach, sitting ducks. The response of the British military and what was left, inadequate, and British civil society saw the existential threat and rose to the occasion. Donald Trump, I hope, is our Dunkirk. And our Dunkirk in two ways. One is we have to recognize that a society divided is a society that cannot survive. And we are divided politically now, tribally, blue states and red states, seeing others as the enemy and not just as an adversary, driven more by our antipathy towards our fellow citizens who are on the other side of the aisle, more Americans saying they would be upset if a child of theirs married somebody from the other party than somebody from another religion or even another race now, I kid you not. We are divided into geographical boundaries where metropolitan areas that are highly educated and are thriving in the global economy find that they are facing a very different atmosphere as you move to smaller towns and into rural areas where they are less educated and less able to cope with these changes, and the society is coming apart at the seams, and that's within blue states and red states. And if we don't find a way to heal those wounds, and that includes the greater racial divide that we have now than we have had in some time, then we are not going to be able to survive in the way that we have before. And that could have gone on if we hadn't had a Trump until it was at a point of no return. And now I think we're starting to realize that we have to find ways to communicate with one another and build a different level of empathy and build it around a new patriotism that celebrates what we are and what we can be and what we should be, and a new optimism. And at the same time, the existential threat to our democracy posed by a president who is not like any we've had before, and by a political system that is not responding to a popular will in any fashion. And we see that with proposals on health care and on taxes and in many other areas, that we will now find our way forward. And there are ways of altering the structures of the political system to help to move us back in a different direction. And what we're seeing is this wonderful response from so many elements of the civil society. And that includes lawyers, probably more lawyer jokes than any other in the society, but look at how lawyers responded to the travel ban. Look at how they've responded with pro bono efforts, with people boning up on immigration law so they can help those who are caught up in this cruel approach that we're seeing, another part of the kakistocracy, which I would add was shaped by John Kelly, now the Chief of Staff. And I do not want to let him off the hook at all for some of the horrible things that have happened in the Department of Homeland Security and with ICE. And we're seeing it with religious groups that are stepping up, including the Catholic bishops, moving back to help protect the safety net and the least among us, one of the great callings of all of our great religions, and with efforts to build both sanctuary congregations, but also to create a different climate and dialogue in the society. We're seeing it with some of the groups like the Campaign Legal Center, which I am a chair, the CREW, the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, taking on the kleptocracy and some of the other challenges to the law in the system. We're seeing it with the Mueller investigation, and we're seeing it with groups like Indivisible, rising from the grassroots up to get out there and mobilize. And what we're seeing is that there's a different response than we've had before. The Occupy movement, in contrast to the Tea Party movement, occupied, and then they went away. Now what we're seeing is more sustained effort, and that played out in those elections in Virginia and other places last Tuesday. And it's not just in elections, it's in moving in to make sure that members of Congress and others know that their actions are being watched and to hold them accountable for it. And with that, and if we can create a different way, and this is a tough thing, separating out a group of people who are truly evil. There are evil people in this society who are exploiting racism and anti-Semitism and ugly values to separate us, and some of them in a tribal media because they can make a lot of money, but others because with social media now you can build a network that reinforces some of those views, separating them out from others who may support political figures exploiting those views, but are doing it out of the great upheaval that they faced in their lives and the sense of despair that they feel towards their futures and those of their children. And we have to find a way to develop a different kind of dialogue with them. And if we can do all of those things, we will not just survive all of this, but we can thrive out of it in creating a better America. And with that, I will say two things. One, have a nice day. And two, remember, the holidays are coming. And now I'm happy to take some questions or comments. Yes, sir.
A couple of things. First, on the State Department, it seems the intentional denuding of the State Department and the choice of Tillerson, Putin's buddy, doesn't seem accidental. So, two questions. First, do you think it's accidental that Tillerson, Secretary of State, presiding over this, what's going on? Also, because not much said about it, do you think the Mueller investigation is going to get to this, and where do you see that going? But lastly and importantly, the structural solutions. I don't hear you talking about the structural solutions in terms of the Electoral College. I mean, obviously, if that could be fixed, then the Democrats would seemingly win most elections. So that would seem crucial, the Electoral College. Can you say something more about it?
So, yeah, just very quickly on those. You know, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that Rex Tillerson is Secretary of State because Condoleezza Rice and Bob Gates recommended him. They had served on an Exxon committee with him and thought he was really smart and might be good. And I hope every night they kick themselves for what they have done. We know that one of the reasons that Tillerson was picked is because he looks like a Secretary of State, and that Bob Corker was not picked because he's too short. Kakistocracy. But I don't think any of us expected that Tillerson would be systematically destroying the State Department the way he is. And I'm not sure what the reasons are, but we also know that a guy from Exxon who was awarded the top medal from Russia is somebody who needs to be watched very carefully. On the Electoral College, we are strong supporters of the electoral vote compact in states. You don't have to do this with a constitutional amendment. 165 electoral votes represented now in states that have passed laws that as soon as you get over the 270 mark, they will, in their law, direct that the electors be granted to the winner of the national popular vote. That would help. There's still some structural issues and dilemmas, though.
But is that going anywhere?
It's going to take a while. And of course, one of the problems is that small states have no great interest in changing things. I would also say this is not a matter of guaranteeing that Democrats can win elections. What's important is that we have two vibrant parties that can compete for national elections. Republican Party will be a conservative party. The choice is, do they try to have policies that can reach out more broadly to compete in a fair national election, or do they instead narrow the choice to rely on billionaires funding them and on voter suppression? And I think the country and the Republican Party would be so much better served if they moved in the former direction. Yes, sir.
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about the Republican philosophy about starving the beast? And that's maybe one of the reasons why they're doing what they're doing with the State Department.
Sure. So starving the beast. One of the things that's happened is we have a Republican Party that's gone from a conservative party, which believes that government should be smaller and leaner and meaner, but that we need government, many parts of it, and those parts should work effectively and efficiently. And one part has always been diplomacy and our positioning abroad. Now it's a radical version, and the radical version is if any part of government works well, that's bad because people will like it and they'll want more of it. And the tax bill is, very much aimed at cutting out revenue from the government and then forcing government to downsize as a consequence. It's a cynical approach. To some degree, it goes back to David Stockman at the beginning of the Reagan administration, who then denounced it because he said it can't work. And of course, the places that are the most vulnerable, the ones that they're aiming at more than anything else, are Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid. Those are the big ones. And the tax bill hits Medicare and Medicaid directly. $25 billion taken immediately out of Medicare, and that's going to have a big impact on dual eligibles, and it's going to have a real impact on the system itself, and it's not a functioning government's approach to actually helping citizens. Yes.
While there's more than enough reason to blame the Republicans for where we're at now, part of the problem is also on the shoulders of the Democrats. I'm reminded of a story about how LBJ, when he was, I think, in West Virginia, was actually went to the trouble to talk to this one particular person you know this story, I see, where he got down and he talked to this one particular person who had voted steadily Republican all his life, but because LBJ went in there and talked to him personally, he got him to not only to get this man to switch his vote, but the county to switch how it voted. I think that the big problem is that Democrats have ceded too much of the country to the Republicans. It's a big problem because most of the problems that you mentioned are systemic, and to fix many of those problems, the Electoral College, too much money in the system, and gerrymandering.
Let me answer in a couple of ways. The first is there are no angels here. This is not one wonderful group of people and one horrible group of people. It's the nature of politics. Having said that, the Democrats have also made some great mistakes here, and we have a chapter in the book on economics with what I think is a kind of at least blueprint for how to perform and behave. And a good part of it is you cannot pit one group's pain against another. And we can't talk about the white working class. We should be talking about the working class. This has been a problem that has stressed all communities, and there are policies that can help deal with them and alleviate the pain. And you also cannot approach this simply from an elitist perspective. Now, when you talk about analogies, looking at the past, many people have said our politics, the analogy is probably the period leading up to the Civil War, which you really don't want to have as your analogy. But I would also argue that very powerfully, this can be a little bit like Reconstruction. And if you remember, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the South had basically white sharecroppers with freed blacks, all of whom were struggling to make it, and a small group of economic elites exploiting the system, and an easy opening that was almost there for the working people to unite and take on those elites. And what the elites did was realize they could use race as the wedge to exploit and divide. And we're paying a price for that even now, and we're seeing it again. And we have to fight against that, but the way to fight against it is to have empathy for all groups that are facing these stresses and try and find ways for each of them to see why others have pain and look at it through a different prism. So, thanks. Yeah.
Yes. You spent a lot of time talking about how Trump used racism, appeals to racism in his campaign, supposedly, although there's really not any proof of that. But what I wanted to ask you kind of like the opposite argument that I hear a lot is that maybe it's the Democrats that are the racists because they're constantly using the race card every year and trying to drum up hatred for white people with the Black Lives Matter and all that stuff. And in addition to that, of course, the open borders, which I constantly hear Democrats and liberals like you say, by 2050, whites will be a minority. Isn't that great? And you get a big applause. You're the racists. You want to displace the white population by 2050 if we continue these immigration policies. How is that not racism? You are the racist.
So, first, just one little piece of evidence. When you see marchers in Charlottesville, some of them wearing white hoods and chanting racist and anti-Semitic slogans, and the president says there are a lot of fine people there, and says nothing after a bunch of people are murdered in a church in Charleston, I view that as evidence, and I think we have a lot more. When you run a long campaign saying that Barack Obama was born in Kenya is not a legitimate president, I think the writing is on the wall with that one. Now, having said that, and I don't celebrate the fact that the country will not be a majority white after 2050. I view it as a reality. I will tell you that you can go back to the 1920s and 1930s, and there were all kinds of people who talked about the scourge of those horrible Irish and Italians coming in and polluting the country, and the same with other ethnic groups that faced a different reality. As my late colleague Ben Wattenberg said, people want to come to this country because they want to make better lives for themselves and others, and because they celebrate the freedom and prosperity of America. They're the right kinds of people to come here. They have built this country into what it is, whatever their race or creed or national origin or religion. And that doesn't mean you don't have ways of protecting your borders. And yet, when you have a party now that's trying to cut legal immigration as well as illegal immigration, I do not find that as being something that fits either our traditions or our ability to thrive in the future. If we're going to end up like many European countries with aging populations and young people who can't even pay for what will happen to those older people, if we don't have a vibrant young workforce that really wants to make it and make their families better, we're not going to survive as a country. And I just do not view that in the same way. Now, having said that, I don't think there is a contradiction between understanding what the Black Lives Matter movement is all about. I cannot imagine, I get emotional with this stuff because I lost a son. I can't imagine what it was like, what it is like for a family to send a teenager out for an evening and worry that that kid might be shot by a cop just for driving while black. There is a difference. Those things happen in this society. But you can feel that pain and also feel the pain of a family in a small town caught up with an opioid addiction because the jobs aren't there and because the society isn't providing for them. There is nothing that says one is inimical to the other. And what we have to do is make people understand all of that pain. Yes, sir.
I appreciate that. Tom Perez, the new DNC chair, strikes me as an awfully good guy. I love his energy, and I listened to everything he said leading up to the elections and after. It's my sense that he talks about, the tenets quite often, as he should, to keep things pithy. Yet every time I watch and listen to him, he has never said anything specific about economic growth, and it strikes me that he, by default, to a degree, if that continues, runs the risk of ceding that issue to the Republicans in a period where independents are going to be crucial. Any thoughts?
Yeah, and I do think there are two camps, I think, in a party in the minority. One is you just highlight your opposition to what the majority is doing, and it's almost the sense that if somebody's committing suicide, you don't, kill them along the way. But the other is that you offer your own positive agenda. And if you don't do that, you may succeed in a midterm election, but you're not going to be prepared to govern. And if you can't offer people some sense of hope, which is why one chapter in this book that makes a great holiday gift is an economic agenda, and it's about creating growth and jobs. And by the way, there are many ways in a tax bill to provide incentives for companies to actually do jobs instead of just saying, give them more money and it'll trickle down, when it trickles down to the shareholders and the CEOs. But what we've seen is an enormous reservoir of money in corporations that they could use to create more jobs that they don't. You need to have incentives to do it. I'd like to see those alternatives, but I also want to see a Democratic Party that starts to put resources into state legislative races and into Secretary of State races, which are the ones that control elections. So there are a lot of things that have to be done. Tom Perez has a lot of energy. I hope he begins to channel it in a different way, and I hope that the Democrats in Congress and in the states start to work on their own plans. I have about 5 more minutes. If I could just take the remaining questions, and then I'll try to answer them, take them all, and then I'll answer.
Okay. In January, we're going to do a book study of your book at Coral Gables Congregational Church, for anybody who's interested, particularly focusing on the last part, on the sort of positive proposals. I wonder if there's any of those proposals that you'd like to particularly highlight this morning.
Sure.
Hello. I wanted to thank you for your shout out to the legal community for part of the pushback. I worked for the American Civil Liberties Union for the last 40 years, and we were
Thank you.
heavily involved in that. But I want to change the subject and ask you, today's New York Times editorial talks about the significance of, in Virginia, of the refranchisement of the right to vote for former felons in Virginia. Yeah. And I want to make a little commercial here. We have the opportunity to change Florida, and in changing Florida, change the country by the effort here in Florida. People here will see petitions outside, and if we can refranchise over 1 million people here in Florida, that's one of the major ways we might be able to accomplish many of the things that you've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned Orrin Hatch, and he also sponsored the Orphan Drug Act back in 1983. The current tax bill now takes away the incentive for rare disease drug research. What can we do now to say, come back to being your compassionate self, Mr. Hatch?
Thanks.
What can we do?
Okay. So just quickly on all of those. In terms of proposals, if we're looking at the structures of government, we need to not just focus on the Electoral College, but we need to look at both redistricting reform and what I hope will be one very good change that we could make state by state in our presidential elections, which is to allow ranked choice voting or preference voting, so that you not only vote for your first choice, you do your second and your third, and then those votes get allocated as you move further down. And that's because I want to remove the possibility that a Jill Stein or a Ralph Nader or a Pat Buchanan can switch the outcome of an election. And let them have opportunities, and let people vote for those if they want, but not alter the results of an election, because those votes would then be allocated. So there are a lot of proposals in there worth discussing. On the felon reenfranchisement, if you look at some of the videos on YouTube of former felons in Virginia able to vote for the first time, people who had paid their debt to society, who were productive citizens and wanted back a very precious right. And many of them, and it hits certainly African Americans more than others, but plenty of others as well. Many of them caught up in the drug wave with these mandatory minimum sentences, put away for many years, didn't do anything horrible or violent. The idea that they are forever forbidden from voting, I think, is an anathema. And on Orrin Hatch, who I've worked with in the past and who I would call a friend in the past, who has been an enormous disappointment, and you look at this tax bill with many provisions like the orphan drug one, like taking the scholarship opportunities away. If you're Vladimir Putin and you want to destroy America's primacy in science and technology, boy, you'd love this particular provision. One of the things that all of us have to do is to go out and get to members of Congress, and because this bill is going to come around again in the House, and we're going to see a vote very soon in the Senate, and Marco Rubio has to be informed about the horrible things in this bill and what they would do to Floridians as well as to others in the country, and hold people to account for the votes that they cast. And then Orrin Hatch is going to be leaving before long, somehow bringing him back to being the problem-solving conservative that he was. It really has to be a task for people in Utah, I'm afraid, and for those of us outside who are able to hit him on Twitter, as I do on a fairly regular basis. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Ornstein. And Norman Ornstein will be signing his book on this floor on the other side of the elevators. So please make your way there if you'd like to have your book autographed. Thank you. Please help us by leaving the room as quickly as possible if you're not remaining for the next program. Thank you.